In the first quarter of 2026, China's trade surplus fell to a 4-year low, while its semiconductor import bill hit a single-quarter record of $135 billion, enough to fund the annual government budgets of several mid-sized European nations, arriving in the same weeks that state media was publishing headline after headline about domestic chip breakthroughs and growing technological independence. Hold both facts in the same frame. One says China's artificial intelligence ambition is scaling faster than any supply chain on Earth can feed. The other says a country that cannot supply its own compute has not leapfrogged anyone. Both facts come from the same ledger line, and the ledger does not editorialize. The restriction that was supposed to settle this tightened United States export controls on advanced logic chips, instead forced a capital reallocation so large that it has paradoxically deepened China's short-term import dependency, while simultaneously funding the facilities that might eventually dissolve it. The round meant to end China's artificial intelligence compute run is, on the current evidence, the round that made this import record possible. 3 rounds score the contest. What domestic chips can actually do, what is really inside that $135 billion figure, and whether buying time counts as winning a race. Domestic chip progress in China is genuine and should not be dismissed. Huawei's Ascend line, the flagship of that effort, has published benchmark claims suggesting competitive inference performance on chips fabricated inside China's own foundry ecosystem. Domestic cloud providers are running deployments at scale on that silicon. The company's framing is consistent. Self-sufficiency is presented as a present-tense project, not a future aspiration. The counterclaim cuts at the use case. Independent benchmark verification for the highest-end domestic artificial intelligence chips remains thin. Analysts tracking Chinese data center construction note that domestic chips serving those deployments are largely adequate for inference workloads on already trained models, which is a meaningfully less demanding task than frontier training runs requiring the densest, most interconnect-rich silicon available. Reports from semiconductor research firms suggest domestic chips hold a growing share of inference deployment, but that frontier model training inside China still leans heavily on chips acquired before the most recent export control tightening, or on workarounds whose legal status remains contested. No domestic chip has been independently benchmarked against current generation high-end silicon on training throughput. The company claims are not fabricated. They are also not audited. Round 1 to the skeptics. Domestic progress is real, and deployment is real, but the use case it serves is not the use case driving the import record. Training demand is the engine of that $135 billion, and that demand is not yet met at home. The bullish camp's answer to the import figure is disarmingly simple. Record imports are exactly what you would expect from a country whose artificial intelligence ambitions are compounding faster than any supply chain can match. The surge is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of scale. Demand is the story, and the demand belongs to China. Composition, though, matters more than headline volume. If the bulk of the surge is concentrated in the highest performance logic chips, precisely the category targeted by United States export controls, then the figure does not describe an economy outgrowing its supply chain. It describes an economy in a race against the tightening of that chain, accumulating what it can still legally or quasi-legally acquire before access narrows further. Trade data parsed by semiconductor analysts is consistent with a pull-forward purchasing pattern that export control watchers have flagged as a recurring response to each new restriction cycle. Whether those chips arrive through authorized channels, gray market intermediaries, or third-country re-export routes is not uniformly clear from trade statistics alone. Reports suggest a meaningful share traveled through paths that have since been closed or are under active investigation. The $135 billion is a verified figure. Its internal composition is partially opaque. Round 2 splits, leaning skeptical. The scale is real, and the artificial intelligence demand driving it is real. But the structure of the surge, concentrated in exactly the restricted categories, arriving in a pre-tightening window, resembles strategic accumulation more than organic scaling. A country importing record quantities of the chip it publicly claims to be replacing has not yet replaced it. The bridge argument is the bullish camp's most sophisticated move, and it deserves a full hearing. Every dollar in that import figure buys a training run. Every training run produces a model. Every model trained on imported silicon can, in principle, be inferred on domestic silicon indefinitely thereafter. The logic is, import the compute once, keep the intelligence permanently. The $135 billion is not dependency on this reading. It is the down payment on a decade of domestically hosted capability. The argument assumes the other end of the bridge is under construction on a timeline that closes the gap. The fabrication bottleneck, the inability to manufacture the most advanced chips at the most advanced process nodes without equipment that is itself under export control, is not resolved by importing finished chips. The Dutch lithography maker's extreme ultraviolet machines remain outside China's domestic production capability, and the foundry capacity being built inside China is concentrated on older process geometries. State-linked investment in semiconductor fabrication has been substantial and multi-year, and it is documented. But analyst estimates of when Chinese-made advanced node capacity reaches volume production vary widely, and the company timelines on this are not independently verified. The constraint that most chip industry analysts identify as the binding one, the lithography equipment gap, is not closed by importing finished processors. The strongest case for the bullish verdict runs through history, not headlines. South Korea imported chip-making equipment for years before it exported finished chips at scale. Taiwan's foundry dominance was preceded by decades of acquiring foreign technology. Applying a self-sufficiency standard in 2026 may be grading on a timeline that no major semiconductor power has ever met in its formative phase. And the model weights argument is not trivial. If the training compute imported now produces models that define Chinese artificial intelligence capabilities for the next several years, the strategic return on that import bill may be asymmetric. Pay once in silicon, harvest in software across many cycles. The assumption that the Dutch lithography maker's machines represent a permanent ceiling also ignores active Chinese research into alternative patterning approaches that could, over a longer horizon, root around that specific constraint. That dissent is coherent, and the historical comparison is fair. But the timeline is doing heavier analytical work than the evidence currently supports. The model weights argument holds only if the models trained on imported silicon remain competitive with models trained on the next generation of chips China cannot yet fabricate at home. And that is a compounding gap rather than a stable one. Every generation of frontier training hardware that China cannot produce domestically widens the distance the bridge has to span. Buying time is a legitimate strategy. The question it cannot answer is whether the domestic build-out closes the equipment gap within the window the import stockpile purchases. That remains genuinely open. Round 3 to the analysts, who call the bridge argument real, but incomplete. The decisive exhibit is the $135 billion figure held alongside the 4-year low in China's trade surplus in the same quarter. State media can publish a breakthrough story on any given morning. A trade ledger is harder to editorialize. The two data points together describe a country spending at extraordinary rates on the exact input its national strategy says it no longer needs. The bulls cannot explain away a record import dependency in the year of peak independence rhetoric. The skeptics cannot explain away the genuine domestic deployment scale those imports are enabling. The number belongs to both arguments and resolves neither, which is precisely what makes it the actual story. On the current evidence, the skeptics win the scorecard, but not the match. China is not losing the semiconductor contest. The domestic investment, the deployment scale, and the strategic patience are all documented and real. But it is not winning on the terms its own narrative claims. And that gap between narrative and ledger is not a minor discrepancy. A country posting record semiconductor imports in its year of independence, headlines has not achieved independence. It has achieved ambition. Why? H is a different thing and a harder one to sustain across compounding technology generations. The $135 billion is not a sign of dominance or a confession of defeat. It is the most precise measurement yet of the distance between the story being told and the supply chain required to make it true. The number that was supposed to prove self-sufficiency turned out to be the clearest measure yet of how far away self-sufficiency remains. Round 2 is the one to argue with. If the import composition data is partially opaque, should that quarter's figure be read as strategic accumulation or organic scaling driven by genuine demand? Make the case in the comments. And if the trade data or export control enforcement picture has shifted since this aired, say so directly. Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow every round of this contest. as the foundry data, the export control updates, and the independent benchmark results come in, because this fight is not close to over.